Good afternoon to those of you on the West Coast, or excuse me, good morning to those of you on the West Coast, and good afternoon to those in the East. My name is Billy Zidek. I'm the Standards and Codes Administrator for APA. Just a couple of housekeeping items before we get started. This webinar is being recorded. The recording and presentation slides will be posted on our webinar page under Training on the APA website in a few days. All attendees are in listen-only mode. Please type your questions in the chat box, and they will be answered in the order they are received during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. Should we have questions that are unanswered, we will collect the questions. We will send them to our presenter. He will answer them, and then we will post the replies on the website along with the recording and presentation slides. Continuing education credits are being offered for this webinar. Please contact me at billy@apa.org for more information. Also, if you have more than one person attending this session from a central location, let me know and I will send you a form so everyone gets credit for attending the meeting. Our presenter today is John Monteith from NFPA. He is an emergency services specialist, currently assigned as staff liaison to the technical committee for EMS, fire service, occupational and safety and health, hazardous material response, and cross-functional emergency preparedness and response. A nationally registered EMT, John has worked in EMS in several different roles, from the private service to Boston EMS to serving as an EMS duty chief and EMS specialist for the County of Santa Clara EMS agency. In his role at NFPA, John is assigned as representative to the Joint National EMS Leadership Forum, National EMS Advisory Council, NFPA 3000, and the Road to Zero Coalition. At this time, it's my pleasure to turn this presentation over to John.
Thank you, Billy, and thank you everyone for joining us today. I especially want to thank APA for hosting this webinar. It's incredibly important to us that all of our stakeholder groups and audiences hear about NFPA 3000, and APA has been really, really great at not only hosting a webinar like this and a town hall that we did earlier this year, but also having us present at their conference and supporting the standard by working through their codes and standards group to submit public inputs and public comments and to participate in the process. And thank you all again one more time for joining us. We're going to be talking about NFPA 3000 today, Standard for an Active Shooter Hostile Event Response Program, or ASHR program. One of the questions we hear all the time is well, why this standard? What made this happen? Why did this standard why was it needed? And one of the things that I love to point out to people is that there's not even a good definition for what an active shooter or an active hostile assailant event is. And the reason for that is we can't even decide on what to call these things. Many of you probably call them active assailants, high threat responses, active shooters. You may think of them as different things. You may think of them as the same thing. So even in just naming NFPA 3000, we had to be inclusive in how we named it, but we also had to come up with standardization for what these definitions of things are. And the fact that we don't have these definitions makes it difficult to even talk about how many of these incidents have happened. So when you look at this number here, this 250 incidents between 2000 and 2017, that's 250 active shooter incidents as defined by the FBI. And for those of you that don't know the FBI's definition, it's 4 or more dead, not including the shooter, at a single incident. So really, when you think about that, that's very narrowing and limiting. And a lot of people would argue that that's not just what an active shooter incident is. Under that definition, the active shooter at Noblesville, Indiana, that didn't kill anyone, but did shoot in classrooms at a school, would not be considered an active shooter. Same with the active shooter that occurred at the Madden football tournament in Jacksonville recently. So even the definitions is a place of struggle. And really, when you think about that, no wonder there needs to be a standard, because we need to start defining what these things are so we can really study them. And so that's one of the many reasons NFPA 3000 was developed. But let's just look at the FBI's numbers, because even that in its limited scope is staggering. 250 incidents from 2000 to 2017. Within that, over 2,000 killed or injured. 799 specifically were killed in those incidents. And then what's even more amazing is when you look at just the last 2 years. When you look at this map, what you see is that these incidents are occurring all over the United States, except maybe in the north central states or northwestern states. The reason for that, in case anyone was wondering, is because they have dragons. Dragons patrol the streets in those states, and they make it difficult for active shooters and bad guys to go out and cause damage. Actually, what the reality is that those states have all had active shooter hostile event incidents, but they don't fit the FBI's current definition. But under the FBI's definition, when you look at this map, you'll see that they're happening widespread throughout the United States. You'll also notice that California, Texas, and Florida are the 3 states with the highest number of incidents. And that makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because they're also 3 very high population states. When you think about things that would prevent an active shooter and you look at those 3 states, you'll notice that California, Texas, and Florida all have very different gun laws and gun prevention laws. So really, it's hard to find correlation there. But again, it's hard to study it because we didn't even have definitions. What's even more staggering about the last 2 years is the number of incidents and the damage they've done. 50 incidents. That's 20 in 2016 and 30 in 2017. 943 casualties. Almost half the casualties of the last 16 years have occurred in just the last 2 years. And then the number killed and wounded, 221 killed, 722 wounded. Again, staggering numbers. And when you step it back and you look at the previous numbers, and you see that almost half of those numbers of people that were either casualties, killed or wounded, you see almost a third of the number killed in just the last 2 years. You see the number of incidents going up in just the last 2 years. It tells you, wow, these things are happening more frequently. They're also happening more severely. One other thing to note, from 2000 to 2008, this country averaged 6.4 incidents under this current definition per year. 6.4. From 2008 to 2017, that number went up to 18.4. Again, just showing that they're happening, they're more severe, and they're happening more frequently. Another question we get all the time is, well, where do these incidents happen? And again, using the FBI's data, we have some ideas of where they could occur. Most people would tell us that the number one location where these incidents happen is either at a school or a mall or an office. Those are the top 3 we hear all the time. I always wonder, why doesn't anyone ever say post office anymore? But I guess that was just an 80s thing. But the numbers actually tell us where they happen. The number one location is commerce. And under that, if you look on the chart here, you'll see that it happens mostly at businesses that are open to pedestrian traffic. Businesses that are closed to pedestrian traffic, which is that classic office shooter, that's 29 incidents. And this is from 2000 to 2016. We don't have the 2018 data yet. 2017 data yet for this one. Schools is number 2 at 48, specifically K through 12 with 33 incidents. Then open space is number 3, which with 29 incidents. And when you look at this pie chart, you'll see a trend. So we know they're happening more frequently. We know they're happening more severely. And when we look at this chart, we also see that they happen in places that have easy access to victims. So what does that tell you? It tells you, okay, knowing those 3 things, what can we do to be better prepared? Well, one thing we can do to be better prepared is to find ways to reduce or inhibit their ability to access victims in those places. And then the other, we know from medical science, is if there are victims, we want to get to them as quickly as possible and stop bleeding. So those are the 2 things, if you just root cause it down, that need to be done from a pure preparedness and response perspective, just based on the data that we currently have. So a question that we always hear is well, why the NFPA? My favorite is, what's a Fire Protection Association doing making a standard for active shooter hostile event preparedness? And it always makes me laugh. I think one of the things people don't realize is that the NFPA has over 330 codes and standards. Excuse me, I have a little bit of a dry cough. So we have over 330 codes and standards, and only a third of them are directly related to fire and fire prevention. The NFPA has standards for electricians, has standards for the healthcare industry. NFPA 99 is adopted by both the Joint Commission and the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid, CMS, as standards that hospitals and healthcare facilities have to be compliant with in order to get accreditation. And there's many, many other standards as well that have to do with a lot of other things. For those of you that do emergency management, I'm sure you're familiar with NFPA 1600 that was adopted by Congress as part of the 9/11 series of laws that were enacted. For those of you that work with small unmanned aerial systems, there's NFPA 2400. And we're currently in the process of developing a standard even now for spaceports. So there's all these fascinating things that you would think, what the heck is the NFPA doing? But what you have to understand is our expertise isn't just fire prevention. It's certainly something we have expertise in, but our true ability and our true expertise is developing standards and codes. And we do that through our process. It's time tested, it's over 100 years old, and our standards are in the United States are all accredited by ANSI. And we have a consensus process that's known and recognized, and it's considered the gold standard for how you do this. So that's really why the NFPA. The how is really interesting. In 2016, the Pulse nightclub incident occurred. And after the Pulse nightclub incident, there was an after-action meeting where all the response organizations, fire, police, everybody, got together and they talked about, well, what went right, what went wrong, what can we do to get it better? One of the questions that came up was, what should we have done before this incident? What were the standards we should have followed? And what they found out was there were no standards. There was really good guidance, things like the Hartford Consensus, the DHS white paper, the FBI papers that were put out, lots of good guidance, but none of those things were accredited defensible standards, things that they knew were those bare minimums that they needed to have done. And they said, we got to do something about that. So Otto Drozd from Orange County, Florida, the fire chief there, submitted on behalf of the group and other organizations a request to the NFPA in October of 2016 to develop this new standard. We put it out for public input right then and there, and we said, public, should we do this? We received 97% supportive inputs. And just so you know, we received 157 inputs saying, do this. On average, we received 20 for a normal standard. So this one already was getting a lot of attention. But universally, it was supported. After we got all that input saying we should do this, we said, okay, if this is approved, we need a committee to write it and to be the ones that shepherd it. We received 103 applications, which is the most we've ever received for a new technical committee. In April of 2017, the Technical Committee for Cross-Functional Preparedness and Response was formed and charged with developing this new standard. They met for the first time on June 12, 2017, a really significant date because it was the 1-year anniversary of the Pulse nightclub. So in 1 year from that horrific incident, one of their after-action items was rolling down the hill. And that's really impressive when you think about it. And this committee was very large, representing lots of stakeholder groups, and we're going to talk about who's on it shortly. And they started writing the standard. That same day was the Alexandria, Virginia attack on the congressional baseball game where Steve Scalise was shot. So many committee members actually had to get up and leave and head back to Virginia to respond to that event, or to the DC area. But throughout 2017, the committee worked on the standard. They developed what was going to be a working draft. And September 29th, 2017, they had one of their last drafting meetings. They knew they were going to meet one more time, but they were almost done. And we went and we toured the Pulse site as a group. And we learned from the owner of the Pulse what happened and what her experience was with the event. And when that was done, everybody went their separate ways, and we knew we were going to meet again in November. And 2 days later was October 1st, 2017, which was the Route 91 attack in Las Vegas. There was a committee member from Las Vegas who responded to that incident, and it was horrific. So in November, the committee got back together and they said, wow, just throughout this year, we've seen more incidents. They're more severe and they're not going away. We believe there's an emergency need for this standard in our country and in the world. What can we do to make this go faster? The normal NFPA standard takes 3 to 5 years to develop. NFPA 3000 hadn't even been worked on for a year at that time. So the committee unanimously voted to send a letter to the NFPA Standards Council, which is the governing body of the standards, and asked if we could accelerate the process. And the council unanimously agreed. So did the NFPA Board of Directors, and so did ANSI, the American National Standards Institute. There was an emergency need for this standard. So they all agreed to release this as the second ever in over 100 years of developing standards, provisional standard in the history of the NFPA. And what that means is that it's a fully accredited standard. You can use it and adopt it in your places of work and in your communities today. It's just that it was developed faster than the normal process. And it's in cycle right now and will be updated for the 2020 revisions of NFPA standards. So who is this committee? Who are these people that made these decisions and worked on it? Well, there's 55 members currently on the committee. It represents law enforcement, fire, EMS, emergency management, facility management, healthcare, higher education administration, private security, and much, much more. Manufacturers, technology companies, all sorts of different groups are working on this standard. And not just different representatives, but different organizations. FEMA, DHS, DOJ, DOD, FBI, IACP, IAFC, LMNOP, QRS, TUV. As a matter of fact, I think the only letter that's not represented on the technical committee is R, and that's in honor of me being from Massachusetts, and we don't like to use our R's. There's all kinds of agency representation on this committee. And all NFPA committees have to be balanced. No more than a third of the committee can be one user group. For example, you can't have more than a third that are labor or labor union representatives. You can't have more than a third that are manufacturers. They have to be balanced. This committee is balanced, but it's also balanced another way. It's balanced in that no more than a third are fire, law enforcement, EMS, emergency management. They all have equal numbers of representation for their disciplines. And that's really important because as this standard was developed and as now we're learning as it's in our communities, it's really important that all sections of the community feel represented as the standard's going. And there's also some really interesting expertise on the committee. There are two people, one who lost their daughter at Sandy Hook and one who was shot at Virginia Tech, that are currently on the committee. There's also a police officer that was shot 15 times in Oak Creek, Wisconsin. There's a doctor from Sandy Hook, a doctor from the Boston Marathon. As a matter of fact, there's 9 physicians on the committee, all of whom worked on the Hartford Consensus, which is the guiding doctrine for most medical communities as it relates to trauma care in these instances. So this committee has a lot of special expertise. There's 11 people separate of the doctors that have responded to major active shooter hostile events in this country. But it also represents you, and it represents our communities. So what does it do? It provides information to mitigate the loss of life and impact to a community, and it empowers communities to plan, respond, and recover from these events in a unified manner, together. Here's what it doesn't do. It doesn't prevent these incidents from happening. This isn't a prevention document. You won't see anything about gun or gun control. You won't see anything about hardening sites and site security plans. And you also won't see anything about local tactics. Your local plans, policies, and procedures are impossible to standardize. I'm an EMS guy, so I like to tell people, if you've seen one EMS system in the United States, congratulations, you've seen one EMS system. Everybody has different ways of doing things, and standardization isn't about that. It's about getting you on the same page. So the goal of the standard isn't to tell you how you go and you rescue people. The goal of the standard is to tell you that you need to go and rescue people. You need to have a plan for it. You need to train for it. And you have to do it together because it's a whole community's problem. That's the goal of the standard. How you do it, that's you. That's your local standard. That's your local policies and procedures. So how does it do that? Well, it does that by having a little bit of something for everybody. There's stuff in NFPA 3000 for your community leaders, for the emergency management community, even the public. That's one that's constantly forgotten. We got to train our public. And you folks, as facility managers and as people that are campus emergency managers, um, you have a responsibility to train the populations on your facilities and campuses to what your expectations are of them. How many of you out there now, I wonder, are training your occupants on bleeding control or run, hide, fight or Alice or one of those programs? Again, those are all tactics. We're not dictating which ones you choose, but we are saying pick some, have a plan, and practice it and train your occupants because they have a role to play. It takes 6 or 7 minutes for first responders to show up and get organized in the perfect scenario, and none of these are perfect scenarios. The public has a huge role to play. So does the healthcare community. And it's not just the hospital community. Your public health department has a massive role to play. Your coroners, your medical examiners. You have your non-governmental partners, faith-based organizations, church groups. They play massive roles in recovery. What about the American Red Cross or the Salvation Army? Red Cross has all kinds of services, and they can set up a family assistance center very quickly. Salvation Army can do canteening and feeding and securing clothes and donations management. You have to include everyone in these plans and how you prepare for them as communities and even singularly as facilities or campuses. So, as NFPA 3000 was being drafted, the technical committee discovered something, and this actually came about very organically. What they discovered was that there's 4 concepts that keep coming up in every single chapter and every single discussion and every single meeting. So we decided to memorialize that by calling them the main 4 concepts, the 4 main concepts. And what they are is, as I discussed, whole community. This is a whole community's event. It's not one singular agency or entity's event. And the best example I can give you of that is, I wonder how many of you here think this is a purely law enforcement event. This is a law enforcement issue. And I've heard this in a lot of places throughout the country where they go, yeah, it's a law enforcement event. And my argument back is, absolutely it is. But me as an EMS chief, I would tell you it's law enforcement's crime scene and it's my mass casualty incident. What about the person who's responsible for mental health recovery? Is that not their responsibility? Or is law enforcement going to provide those services? Is law enforcement going to do donations management? Is law enforcement going to do primary medical care? Is law enforcement going to do continued support and financial assistance? Probably not. Maybe in some cases, but probably not. It's a whole community's problem. Law enforcement drives their component, but everybody's got a component. And that's the message that really needs to be delivered, because planning in silos and working individually and planning and working on your specific parts without even discussing with your partner organizations what they're going to do is going to inhibit the ability to make this event successful, or as successful as it can be. The next one's unified command. And as Billy told you, I did spend some time in California, and when I first got there, I assumed that their idea of unified command was going to be 2 Priuses on the highway coming upon a merge, and both vehicles stop, get out of their Priuses, and talk about how they feel. The reality is unified command is the leaders of the different organizations that are responding to an event coming together to manage the event together. They're still responsible for their components. Law enforcement's still responsible for the law enforcement pieces. Just because I'm an EMS chief in unified command with them doesn't mean I'm going to tell them how to do their police work. But I don't expect them to tell me where to send my ambulances unless there's a safety or security issue. And that's the point. We all have functions and roles, and we need to work together. Unified command is no different. Working together in unified command is going to help you manage these incidents as successfully as they can be managed. And it's proven to be true. The best example I can give you is the Boston Marathon, an event that's near and dear to my heart. And I was not there on April 15th, 2013. I was out in California, but I worked at many marathons, 10 of them to be exact, over my career when I worked at Boston EMS. One of the things they've done since the 80s is they take the commanders and leaders of EMS, police, fire, even more emergency management, public health, public works, and they lock them in a room they throw some Dunkin' Donuts in there because the best way to keep Bostonians in a room is to throw some Dunkin' Donuts in the room. And they tell them, you're all going to work together. You have to manage this together. And they call it the Unified Command Center, or the UCC. It's a process and a model that works. And by using it on the special events like Marathon Day, 4th of July, First Night, Sail Boston, Caribbean Festival, all these major events that happened in the city, they would activate this Unified Command Center and they would use Unified Command. It trickled down to the field guys. My natural instinct, even being on a first arriving ambulance at a structure fire, would be to walk up to the district chief and say, "Hey, chief, I'm here. Let me know if you need anything. I'll be standing right over there." That simple exchange directly between the chief and myself can save a life, because now if the firefighter, God forbid, were to get injured or fall or need rescue out of the building, he knew exactly where to turn and get me to go and provide that care. Simple things like that trickle down and they work. The next is integrated response. And when people hear integrated response, their first thing to think of is a rescue task force. Rescue task force is a tactic. That's a choice that you make as a community. What the committee means by integrated response is that concept of commanders working together needs to trickle down into the field for responders. That means groups of police, fire, EMS working together as a unified team to go and effect rescue and save lives in some way, shape, or form based on your local tactics and capabilities. And there's some places where law enforcement are the only ones that go in, and fire and EMS set up what's called a casualty collection point, and law enforcement designates specific teams whose job it is to go get victims and bring them to the casualty collection point. That's a tactic that can work for that community based on their capabilities and their threat assessment. But every community needs to come up with those tactics, and any tactics you come up with need to be integrated. For those of you with college campuses, that could mean integrating your campus law enforcement with your surrounding communities and mutual aid partners. All of these things are critical, and everybody does it a little different. But we do know you need to be integrated and you need to train together and practice this together. And the final concept is planned recovery. And that sounds kind of like a strange thing, or counterintuitive, I would say. What do you mean planned recovery? Here's what we know. We know from people that have experienced these horrendous events that recovery is the most difficult, longest lasting phase. It's also the one that everyone is the least prepared for. And the committee is determined to help communities plan for recovery right now. So after we finish this webinar today, all of you should go and work on your recovery plans and at least look and see what they are. Because recovery is the most complicated, requires the most detail, and is the most perilous part of these events. These events never go away. Somebody who loses a limb at a bombing site is always going to require special services moving forward. They're going to accommodate, they're going to adjust, they're going to find their new normal, but they're going to need their community's help. And having a good recovery plan is how you start down that path. There's amazing stories like from Sandy Hook where they received so many teddy bears, they didn't know what to do with them. And during their recovery phase of the incident, they actually had to figure out what to do with thousands of teddy bears that they had no home for. They had no place to put them. They'd given them to first responder groups all around the region. They still had thousands left over in a warehouse, and they were actually renting warehouse space for teddy bears. What they decided to do was really interesting. They took them all to a site. They called the site Sacred Soil, and they burnt the teddy bears in a giant bonfire. As crazy as that sounds, it's a pretty amazing thing, because then they took the ash of the teddy bears and they made a brick. And that brick is called Sacred Soil. And that brick now sits at the memorial for the victims of the Sandy Hook site. They took a complicated and difficult thing into something beautiful that's meaningful to their community. But imagine being in the fog of that event and not even knowing what to do with your donations. That's something the committee feels very strongly you have to avoid. So when you look at NFPA 3000, you'll notice the recovery chapter is probably the most detailed one. And there's a reason for that. It's the one where you need to have the most plans, policies, and procedures in place. So now let's get into a little bit more detail what's in NFPA 3000. And when you look here, you'll see that there's a roadmap. The chapters are broken into plan, respond, recover. Knowing that the 4 themes fit into every chapter, you can see when you're trying to figure out what phase of the event you're working on or what phase of your planning process you're working on, you can find the chapters right there. Let's get into a little bit more detail about risk assessment. Risk assessments looked at from two levels. One from a single facility or campus, and then the second level is the community level. And what risk assessment says is you have to identify your threats, analyze your risks, and analyze your consequences based on those threats and risks, including knowing what you currently have in place, what your current capabilities are. So when you think about that, you have to think, well, how do I know what my threats are? How do I know what the threats to my site are? I don't know what the local intelligence community knows about, let's say, gang activity or recent threats made to the area. I don't know what the number one threat is for, let's use my hometown, Brighton, Massachusetts. So you can't really do this risk assessment by yourself. The other thing is, many people that do these risk assessments only know it from their perspective in their current job. Let's say you're an emergency manager. You do it from a situation of knowing hazards and threats, both natural and man-made. Let's say you're an engineer who's been given that role to do it. You think of it from the perspective of an engineer. What you don't think of it from is from the perspective of a responder or a potential assailant. That's why when you do these risk assessments, it's critical, and it creates that whole community concept to invite your response partners and your code enforcement, your fire marshals and your code enforcement officials in to do it with you. It creates familiarity, it creates knowledge on the site, and it brings different perspectives together. And it's a great way to start this. Once you do that risk assessment, excuse me, sorry about the cough. Once you do that risk assessment, that's when you take an opportunity to share that information with your community. And as a community, those of you that are responsible for whole campuses or whole communities, you want to take it to the next level. You want to say, okay, great, now we've done this. The next level would be, how do we do this for our whole community? Let's take all those risk assessments and build a community level risk assessment. So it's two levels. And it promotes the concept of working together. Nobody should do these things in a silo. And then once you've done that risk assessment, once you know what your capabilities are and what your threats and risks are, you want to build your program. And for those of you that have an emergency action plan for your sites or for your campuses, this would be your active shooter hostile event annex. Your active shooter hostile event annex. For those of you that have a all hazards plan for your communities or your campuses, again, this would be your annex for active shooter hostile events. Well, what goes in there? Well, your plans go in there, your policies, your procedures, your community's level involvement and expectations, your resource management and your capabilities, your competencies. And what we mean by competencies is what are the knowledge points you're teaching your responders and your occupants in your community. And then, of course, your recovery plans. And really, one thing we've learned is that recovery from these types of incidents is different from the recovery from a natural disaster or an earthquake or a hurricane. There's a different feel to them, and I'll talk about that when we talk about the recovery chapter. Looking at unified command, you'll notice something that's really interesting there. You see your traditional police, fire, EMS, but you also see location representative and additional participating coordinating agencies as dictated by incident needs. This is a really important lesson that's been learned, and one that APA members made a lot of public input and public comment to as the document was being developed. It's important that a representative for the campus or for the location be part of unified command, because just like when we talked about doing the risk assessment, they have intimate knowledge of the site that can make a difference to the response community as they're making decisions. The best example is that there was a recent active shooter incident, a very severe one, in which law enforcement was viewing video monitors at the location. These video monitors were showing them the active shooter physically present and shooting on the second floor of a building. The reality was those video monitors were on a 20-minute delay, and law enforcement was not aware of this. So law enforcement was delaying medical responders from entering that site to access victims because they believed the shooter was still there based on information that was 20 minutes old. All of this was preventable if somebody from the site was part of the command decision-making in the unified command post with law enforcement. Unfortunately, at that event, they weren't there, and law enforcement was actually completely alone making these decisions. That's just a simple example of an incident in which it's critically important that a location representative be there, not to drive the tactical decisions, but to inform them. So that's why they're listed there, and in the standard, they're shown as equal partner with the response community. Facility readiness is another critical component, and again, APA's membership had a lot of public input there, and input that was accepted by the committee in the final version of the standard. What it says is that you have to have a plan as part of your overall emergency action plan and annex for your facility. It also says that you have to exercise that on an annual basis. And here's where APA's membership played a key role in the development of the standard. That exercise does not have to be full-scale boots on the ground. It can be tabletop and it can be functional. Also, for those of you that are representing an entire campus, that exercise doesn't have to be one per building. It can be for the whole campus or for one single site in the campus. The only thing that they threw in there was that you can even exercise just one part of the plan. Just don't do the same thing 2 years in a row. The next thing is that it talks about the facility, and that exercise should be integrated with your responder community, because again, you want to build that familiarity and understanding between your sites and locations and the response. And the last thing it does is it references directly to NFPA 101 as to what types of doors and door locking devices are allowed and not allowed. Now, it would take a lot of detail here to give you each and every different occupancy type and what the expectations are. All of that can be found in NFPA 101. Specifically, the standard references the 2018 edition. What I can tell you this is, for those of you that have education occupancies, which a lot of college campuses don't have because they're mixed use, but for those of you that have pure education occupancies, the standard specifically says, specifically says that you cannot use barricade devices on interior doors. Instead, you should use code-compliant locks that are lockable from the inside of a room and accessible from the outside of a room via key card, or keypad. And let's take that step by step. The reason you don't want to use the barricade device or a barricade implement on a door and an interior lock is because a lot of these occupancies are public use. And you may have someone with disabilities that would be unable to disengage those devices. The other reason is that, what if the only person in the room that's trained on deploying and undeploying the device is injured or killed? Now everyone's in that room and trapped, and those devices could prevent someone like me, a paramedic, from accessing the room and providing bleeding control. And the last one is that what if the assailant uses this device to barricade themselves in a space and keep responders out? All of those things increase the threat. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't barricade yourself in a room via the act of barricading. If an active shooter is in a building and you want to slide something in front of a door to keep them out, that's okay. This is really talking about that pre-planning, that investment of purchase in a device that's specifically designed to lock or block a door, where we've found through our data that a simple code-compliant lock works equally as well. As a matter of fact, we have data that shows in no active shooter incidents did a shooter breach a locked door. Sandy Hook's the best example. The custodian locked every single door, every single classroom door in the building except for 3, and those were the 3 rooms the shooter entered. We also have data that shows they've shot through doors. In Parkland, as a matter of fact, the shooter shot through an open window through a door. So those devices aren't going to prevent that. So that's why we're saying, as a preparedness measure, we would rather you invest your time and effort in code-compliant locks as opposed to barricade devices. There are some states that allow them. Ohio has some exemptions. Tennessee has some exemptions. However, in any case, our strongest recommendation to all of you that have questions about that is to refer to your local code enforcement or your local fire marshal. Communication center support is about your 911 communications. The average 911 communication center in the United States has 2 operators. Imagine a bar room with 50 people that has an active shooter calling 911, and only 2 people are on the other end able to answer the phone. creates challenges. So the standard really encourages that there's be coordination and interoperability of your communication centers across disciplines, police, fire, and EMS, but also with your neighboring communities to support the incident. If you have the ability to transfer your calls to your neighboring community so that they can take the 911 calls while you do the dispatching, that increases your ability to manage the event. Responder competencies is how we train our first responders. And competency means knowledge of. What it doesn't mean is the ability to perform. That's a certification. Competency is we have an expectation that you are going to train your responders in tasks and competencies based on your local procedures, based to your federal, state, and local requirements for law enforcement, and then finally on threat-based medical care. That's care of self, care of buddy, care of the public, mostly bleeding control, and in scenes of tactical combat, difficult scenarios. That equates to tactical emergency casualty care, or TECC, or tactical combat casualty care, TCCC. TCCC is the military equivalent. TECC is for the civilian environment. And those are both open source, available to you now, programs and training modalities that you can just click on the .org for either one and learn more about. For fire and EMS, it's a little more complicated because they've added zones, hot, warm, and cold, and a fourth zone, which is associated offsite operations, places like hospitals, joint information centers. And they've also broken down the competency knowledge points by shooter, vehicle, IED, and zone. So there's a little more detail. Law enforcement has that same level of detail, but it's not in the mandatory language, it's in the annex. And the reason for that is that this is all new to law enforcement, whereas fire and EMS have had knowledge competencies in standards for many years. So law enforcement put it in the annex as recommended language, and actually the International Association of Chiefs of Police wrote a model policy that they released in April 2018, 1 month before 3000 came out, that a police department can take tomorrow, put their name on, and it'll meet all those detailed needs that's in the annex of the standard. And all you can do is plug in your own local department's capabilities, and now you have your model policy. Personal protective equipment. For law enforcement, that's obvious. They didn't really get into that. But for fire and EMS, what they're saying is if you're going into warm zones knowingly, you should be provided ballistic protection. And what they listed that as is a level 3A minimum ballistic vest, some identifiable garment, and a way to communicate with command. They did know that that's a new and difficult expectation, so they put in language that said you can deviate from this. You just need to investigate it and include it in your after-action report as to why and how it went. Again, that's when you know you're going into these areas. When you're pre-planning that you're going to send your people into those zones, you need to provide them protection, the committee said. Training, not going to get into that very much. I think we've hammered that home. It's all about working integrated, working as a group, working together, training together, and you do need to make some time and financial commitments to do that. But in the long run, you as facilities can drive that, because by including the response community in your training, you're really going to get better bang for your buck. Everyone's going to work together. You're going to develop that familiarity. And over time, God forbid something happens at your facility or your campus, they're going to be a lot more familiar with each other and with what they're doing there. Warning notification and crisis communication. Really, that's a fun one. That's chapter 17, and what that really talks about is communication to the public. I like to call it the Hawaiian Missile Alert chapter. It's about what messages you send, and really the chapter for your PIOs and your organizations has some really good recommendations on what you should be pre-canning. What kind of messages should you pre-develop and lock into your systems so that you can send them right then and there in the moment. But it also talks about using social media as a means of gathering incident information and verifying incident information, or as a means to dispute fake incident information. A common one that I hear all the time is that the Parkland incident, the shooter pulled the fire alarm. Well, actually, he didn't. What we've learned is the fire alarm wasn't pulled at all at Parkland. It was set off by the smoke from the gun. So disinformation is just as dangerous as true information being released, and having somebody on top of the social program following along what's going on and disputing and providing accurate and timely and allowed information is critical to how you inform the public in these incidents. Continuity of operations, as I've said before, that's really about returning to your normal. It's that, excuse me, it's returning to your normal knowing that it's not going to be the same. It's about getting things back to where they are so that your community can normally function. In Pulse, there was a 3-block radius around the nightclub that was unable to do business because of the crime scene area for 3 months. Because of that area lost over it's estimated that they lost over $31 million in revenue. There are businesses that actually closed in that time and have not reopened since. So these events have long-lasting things that affect your communities, and continuity is about getting those things back up and running. Receiving hospitals is all about integration with everyone, the response community, the emergency management community, having those channels, having hospitals having MOUs with their neighboring hospitals, even if they aren't part of the same healthcare network, to distribute resources and things like that, and patients even, will help you in how you manage your incident. And now recovery. As I told you, recovery is the most detailed chapter in the standard, but there's a reason for that. And I'll just give you a simple example. We received a lot of public input saying, why is this chapter so detailed? There's already the National Disaster Response Recovery Framework, the NDRF, National Disaster Recovery Framework. This chapter is unnecessary because this already exists. And the people that worked on the task group that worked on the recovery chapter included people from the Office of Victims of Crime from DOJ. And what they said was, yeah, we've worked on the NDRF too, but this is different. There's no short-term recovery from these incidents. There's no you get your power back on or you reoccupy your home and you're done, you're good. These incidents stick with you, and during the different time periods, there's different things you need to be thinking about. So they really broke that down for you. The biggest one, and one that I always took home, was the issue of financial management. They strongly recommend having a third party be the one that's responsible for the funds that are donated to victims and their families. Things like the One Vegas Fund, the One Boston Fund, even I think it was One Orlando Fund. It's all the same management company because it provides shelter and protection from your organization or your community from litigation and lawsuits. Just that simple anecdote alone tells you that this is a very important thing to think about ahead of time. So I have a call to action for all of you before we get to your questions, and that is learn more about NFPA 3000. Find the things that are and implement them if they're relevant to you. Identify those things that are so important to you that you want to go and work on it today, like planning for recovery. And then take it to your partners and tell them, hey, I worked on this part. This is what I want to do. What are you guys going to do? And that's how you spread the word, and that's how you really get this started. Even if it's just you're doing a risk assessment and you bring your response community in. Find a way to get your neighbors and your partners to work with you. Use 3000 as the basis for that. Tell them that there's a standard out there that says we need to do this. If you want to learn more, go to www.nfpa.org/3000news. On that site, you'll see a training program that we created. It's 3 phases: plan, respond, recover. It's all online. So you get a badge for completing each phase. And basically, you plan, respond, and recover for a fake city known as Beach Point. It looks an awful lot like Quincy, Massachusetts. And you walk through their plan, response, and recovery to a real event in their community. And interwoven in that is videos from committee members and others talking about why this part of the standard is important and why it's there. So you learn more about the standard and you learn how to use it. If you do all 3 phases, you get a badge that calls you a program specialist. And for those of you that are hiring consultants or people that are going to come in and tell you, I'm an NFPA 3000 expert, and within 1 month of releasing the standard, we heard about people saying that, it's important to ask them, well, did you do the online learning? Do you have the program specialist badge? Show it to us. Now, after all of that, I'd love to take some questions through Billy.
At this time, we have none in the queue, so, we have questions popping up now. One of the questions we have is, I'm on the AFAA-NE Board of Directors. How available is the presentation?
Anyone that wants the presentation through that website if they want someone from NFPA to deliver it, they can get my contact info there and just let us know. And I know, Billy, you're going to post the slides and the video of the presentation, correct?
Yes, it will be on the Apple website. It's on our webinar archive page, which is under training. And it should be up in a couple more, it usually takes a couple of days to get it up there. Do we have any other questions for John? If you do, put them in the chat box. Well, John, I think you covered everything on your presentation. I'm not seeing any questions.
That's so rare. Thank you, everyone, for participating today.
Oh, we got a question coming in.
Oh, there it is.
No, I don't see any more questions. So.
Okay.
All right. Well, everyone, I would like to say, John, thank you very much for your time today. It is truly appreciated.
Thank you, Billy.
Wait a minute. Did get a couple more coming in, so if you don't mind.
Oh, sure.
Question. I'll take these in order. And if we don't get through these by the top of the hour, again, we will definitely get we'll get answers back to everybody.
Okay.
Okay. Does the standard address technology that can be implemented to assist with various parts?
In some ways, yes, and in others, no. So the standard recommends exploring new technologies, and in the Annex A of the standard, it talks about some ideas for new technologies that may be beneficial, things like detection systems or threat response systems, or having layered notification systems, so like app-based versus public address versus others. But the standard doesn't get into too much detail of that in the guidance section. It also refers to the other relevant building codes and signal codes like NFPA 72 and NFPA 101, because the detail for like how those things work and what's allowable and what's integrated is there. This is more of a preparedness standard, but it does strongly recommend that you consider technology and technology integration as part of your preparation procedures.
Okay, our next question is there, or how can we get more training on the certification standard and parts?
So you can definitely do the online learning for the badging program. The training parts, like on the competency pieces, those are based on your local policies. So really, you have to find out who's responsible for those pieces of competency. For example, fire and EMS, you have to find out who's responsible for the policies for response to IEDs and different things like that. And they're the ones that should really be driving the training on those components. You may find that there's organizations that are offering training programs based on 3000 that's already kind of started, but there's nothing centralized currently. It may be something that we see in the future, but not yet. It's too new. Remember, this only came out in May of this year, so this is really new.
Okay, our next question. You mentioned these incidents vary from response to natural disasters. How much does this leverage FEMA ICS?
So it absolutely references FEMA ICS, and that's funny that you bring that up, because here's a little known fact. Did anyone on this webinar know, and I wonder if we have, that ICS actually comes from an NFPA standard? NFPA 1561 is the standard for the incident command system, and that's what drives what FEMA adopts as the national ICS rules. So it references both 1561 and FEMA, and says you should use ICS when you're managing these incidents in unified command, which 1561 and FEMA both acknowledge unified command is the way to do this. But again, what people have to remember is when it comes from FEMA, unless it's in the law, it's a recommendation or a guide. and this is a standard.
Okay, another question is, how do we find NFP 101 information on locks?
Oh, that's easy. All NFPA codes and standards are available to view for free at their website. So just as you saw by going to www.nfpa.org/3000, you can type in 101 and you can view 101 for free right there. All you need to do is create a login and you can view it right then and there. And that's all free.
Okay, we have a couple of questions that say, when and where, if any, does NFPA hold on-site training for this topic? Also, how can we join the committee?
Great question. So on-site training, we haven't really rolled that out yet. So if you're interested in that, get my contact off of the webpage and let us know what you would like, because that's something we need to feed back internally that people are looking for on-site training. The other thing, as far as applying for the committee, if you go to the same website, www.nfpa.org/3000 news, you'll see a tab there that says Technical Committee. Click on that tab, and you'll actually see my contact info, the chairman's contact info, and you'll see a thing there that says Apply to be on this committee, and that's where you apply. You can also see who's currently on the committee. So if you're curious who's representing me, you can go there and you can see the names and affiliations of everybody on the committee and their contacts.
And just on a side note too, is as part of the standards and codes work that we do here at APA, this is one standard that I've worked very closely with NFPA and especially John with, to make sure that APA is represented from the higher education side especially. So just want everybody to know that APA is monitoring this, and we will keep you up to date as the stuff goes forward. Another question, we have just a few more. Is there any formal tracking to make sure that municipalities and facilities comply with NFPA 3000?
Well, because it's so new, it's difficult. As far as we know, it hasn't been adopted anywhere yet, and that's not a surprise. It takes years for communities and municipalities to legislatively adopt a standard. As a matter of fact, Life Safety Code, currently CMS, is still on the 2012 edition of 101 for healthcare facilities. So these things take a long period of time. But we do have a thing on the NFPA website called Code Finder. So you can go on there and just type in the search Code Finder, and it'll bring up this thing where you can enter your location, municipality, state, and see what codes and standards, not just NFPA, have been adopted at that location. And it's also crowdsourced information. So if you go there and you're aware of one that has been adopted that's not listed, you can submit it to us to verify that it has been, so we can add it to the list. So it's a good way to look up and see what are the things I'm supposed to be following. So for those of you that have questions about doors and door locking, there's another way to find out what you're supposed to follow in your local area is to go to Code Finder and look up 101 or what door codes are adopted there.
Okay, I think that is all of the questions that we have in our chat box. And I have a couple of minutes before the top of the hour. As we promise everybody, we get you off at the top of the hour. So again, I'd like to thank everyone for taking time out of their busy schedule for attending the webinar. And John, thank you very much for an excellent presentation.
Thank you, Billy, and thank you to everyone that's still on. Really, really appreciate this opportunity. Would love to hear from you. Reach out to us for anything.
Thank you very much, and everyone, have a great afternoon. Bye-bye now.